Welcome to the introduction to Bootstrap part 1. So in this first part, we're just going to go over a little bit about what the Bootstrap framework is, as well as working with getting your initial HTML file set up and how to call some of the basic classes within Bootstrap. So to get started in Bootstrap, you need to go to getbootstrap.com. There it is, getbootstrap.com. And you can hit get started or you can hit download. If you're working offline, you can simply just download Bootstrap, and that way anytime you work offline, your website will show up. If you are always going to be working online, you can work with the what's called the Bootstrap CDN. That Bootstrap CDN, all it is a link within your Bootstrap site that sources all the CSS out there in a relative path. So as long as you're online, your site is going to pull from that CDN. CDN stands for Content Delivery Network. So it's pretty easy to get started as long as you're working online. But like I said, if you want to download it, install it into your machine, that way no matter where you're working, you can work successfully. So some of the basics of Bootstrap. What is Bootstrap in and of itself? Bootstrap is a framework. So it's a framework that requires specific classes within the code. So you're going to call specific classes that's going to call this CSS and along with the JavaScript and jQuery to work correctly within the site. Bootstrap is a mobile-first responsive design. It is assumed that you're working in Bootstrap so that your design is meant to respond and focus on mobile technologies. So when you work in Bootstrap, your site should be responsive. It has 4 built-in breakpoints within it so that these breakpoints your site will break down on a large screen, a smaller screen, a tablet, and a mobile phone. And Bootstrap is battle tested. It's a very solid, uses modern technology. So all of these frameworks have been tested across multiple platforms. So you're not using something that works great in one browser but looks terrible in another. Bootstrap works excellent across multiple platforms. So it's battle tested. The Bootstrap framework is a 12-column grid. So everything you design is going to be thinking about that 12 columns. So as your site breaks down, it still has 12 columns. That's probably the most important thing to note within Bootstrap, is that you're going to be using a 12-column grid. So in order to get started in Bootstrap, I need to get some of the basics here. So I can grab my Bootstrap CDN here. I can download it. There's a couple things, and there's also themes that you can grab that are free to use from the Bootstrap site itself. So definitely make sure you play around within this site. There's a lot of interesting things that you can go and look at. I'm going to jump into the documentation here. So just on the top, clicking documentation. And right here, there's a starter template. I'm going to go ahead and just copy that entire starter template, or I can hit the little copy to clipboard. I'm going to jump over into brackets on my new document, and I'm going to go ahead and paste that. And when I save this, I'm going to just go to File, and do a Save As here. I'm going to create a new folder on my desktop. I'm going to call it Bootstrap Test 1 because I already have that folder. Hit Create, and I'm just going to name this Test. Very important, always write .html when you're in brackets. You must write that file extension out of brackets, otherwise it doesn't know what it is, and hit save. And there you go. I'm going to go ahead and test my site. There we go. There's Hello World. So what we have in the starter template, these are all the links to the Bootstrap minified code out there on the CDN. So if we break down what is here, you've obviously got your HTML5 doc type, English, we've got our head tag, our char set here, and then this tag here basically says, this meta tag says that yes, this is a mobile responsive thing, and then we're linking to this style sheet. You can see that it links right to the Bootstrap CDN off of the Bootstrap website. And then down here on the bottom, we have the links to the jQuery, the popper.js, and the Bootstrap.js. So all the scripting is also there. That scripting comes into play when we're working with things like the modals and the pop-ups and the carousels. We use some of that built-in JavaScript. So all of that is there too. If you play around and you want to get very custom, Bootstrap is totally customizable. You can customize and download and work with your own Bootstrap library. You don't have to go with what's off the shelf. For our intents and purposes, we are just going to use the off-the-shelf Bootstrap exactly how it comes and work with it basically without making any adjustments of our own to the framework itself. So when we think about Bootstrap and we are thinking about how all of our information is appearing on screens, it's important to understand the mobile breakpoints and where they fall. So Bootstrap 3, if you're familiar with it, has 4 breakpoints, so extra small, small, medium, large. Bootstrap 4 added an additional breakpoint, so there is an extra large, large, medium, small, and an extra small. So if you think about what devices those need to go on, extra small and small, and their classes, those really need to go onto a mobile device. The medium needs to, you're thinking about either a small tablet, large cell phone, large, you're hitting large tablets, smaller desktop, and extra large is really meant for all desktop viewing. So those are the classes that you're going to call, and we're going to get more into column classes here in just a minute. So if you think about that grid structure, what does that start to look like when we break down that 12-column grid structure? So everything fits within Bootstrap, fits into a container. You must have a container that everything goes in. Once you're inside your container, you will create a row. That row is going to contain your columns. So you're going to have columns that their measurements add up to 12. If they don't automatically add up to 12, those extra column rows are just going to be left over to the right, simply because everything is going to always float top and left, standard web style. So if I call out a 6-column width and a 6-column width side by side, those are going to take up my 12 columns. So I can mess with column widths when I call for my columns. So if I think of, I want to have a 3-column design, I'm going to call out a width of 4, 4, and 4. 4 plus 4 plus 4 is 12. If I want to take up the full width, it's 12, half and half. And you can also mess with the size if you want to have sidebars, if you want to have a little bit of an offset grid. So thinking about like where I've got a column of 8 plus 2 to make 12. So that can lead into more interesting content as it sits side by side, calling out for my columns to sit next to each other in different rows. So let's start to understand the Bootstrap containers. The container class allows you to control the layout and automatically adds 15 pixels of padding on each side so that the content never fully reaches the edge of the screen. If you want your site to go full width, you would not use a container. So there are 2 types of containers. One is the fixed width container and the other one is the fluid width container. So the fixed width container adds 15 pixels of padding on either side and also adjust to your media query breakpoints. So within our document here, I'm going to go ahead and within my body tag, I'm going to go ahead and create a new div with a class of container. So let's create a new div. I'm going to give it a class of container. And I'm going to wrap that around my hello world here. And I'm going to go ahead and put in some sample paragraphs here. So I'm just going to put in a new paragraph tag. So here I'm going to paste in some lorem ipsum that I copied off of the web. And I'm going to save that. And you see that automatically my hello world that had been to the left because it hadn't been in a container anymore Now I've got that little extra padding on the side, and now as I adjust this, you see that that container is adjusting to match my breakpoints. Now a fixed width container, once your site gets so wide, it kind of stops responding. It's hit that it's about 1200 pixels wide. It's no longer getting any wider. That's how a fixed width container works. So now let's create for ourselves a fluid width container, and then we can see the difference between the two. So back into my HTML file here, I'm gonna, this is the end of fixed width container. I'm gonna go ahead and create a new div. I'm gonna give it a class of container fluid. And within that, I'm going to go ahead and just copy that paragraph tag, my H1 tag, and I will paste it inside my container fluid. Let me go ahead and kind of truncate that paragraph tag real quick to make this easier to read. So I've got my div here. So here's my fixed width container. Here is my end of fluid width container. And then I've got a fluid width container, and I'm going to save that. And you can see the difference between the two. So already there's a lot less padding on that fluid container. And as I go and make my window larger and larger and larger, that fluid width container is simply still going. It's going to go that full width. So while you may want something like this, if you've got a lot of images, or you've got maybe one image, two images that says, yes, I want that to go the full width and keep responding, maybe text shouldn't respond and be that long. So that's a difference in how the two different styles of container work. This is the fixed one up here. This is the fluid width container down here. So they have different application purposes for your design and your layout. Okay, so now I'm going to create a slightly more complex layout using just the containers. So I'm going to place within my site folder that we created a little bit earlier, I created an image folder and I placed in an image off of Unsplash, and I just renamed it BG image for my background image. So then I'm going to jump back into brackets here, and I'm going to go ahead and work with adding in that background image. So within here, outside of so before I've got this container here, but still within my body tag, I'm just going to create a header tag, and I'm going to give it a class of BG image. And within that header, I'm going to create a div, and I'm going to give it a class of container. And within here, I'm just going to create an H1 tag, and I'm going to write the headline. Fantastic. So there's my headline. If I save that, I should get a little headline right here. All right. Now I'm going to just go ahead and create an in-document style sheet here. So I'm going to go ahead and just create within my head tag, create my style tag, just for demonstration purposes. And I'm going to set these CSS rules here for my background image. So I'm going to call that class of BG image. Open that up. And I'm going to set the background image to being URL, going into my images folder. There's that background image, semicolon. And I'm going to set the background position. Background position to being center and center, so that it's centered. I'm going to set the background size to cover. And I'm going to set the height to 200 pixels. Save that. There we go. And that brought in my background image. And you can see that as I scale this, I have that background image going all the way across. So this is not constrained by a container. However, this headline is, so that way if this headline was not within a container, it would also float all the way over. So I can see that's how I got a nice full width browser image. And you can see how this is responding pretty nicely across mobile breakpoints. So now that we've worked with some of the different container classes within Bootstrap, now we're going to dive in a little bit to working with rows and columns. So there's a few guidelines to understand when working with rows. First, rows allow you to create horizontal groups of columns. So if you want to create a multi-column document, they all have to sit within a row. Rows should be placed within a container. So within your container, you must have rows, and then you have your columns. Rows should always include columns, and then the rows will get rid of container padding. So the default container padding gets overridden once you insert a row. So I'm going to go ahead and work within my fixed width container here, and I'm going to add in a row, and then I'm going to put some of this content here, and I'm going to mess around with the different column classes to show you different variations on how you can adjust how they're displayed. So right after my div with the class of container, I'm going to create another div, and that is going to have the class of row. So I need to wrap this ending div for the row around everything so that it's still within end of row. So the proper, let me space this out a little bit so it's easier to understand here. So I can see that here's my container, here is my row, and here is the content within there. So visually that got rid of a little bit of that extra padding by putting that in the row. But now that I've got that row in there, I want to go ahead and add a little bit more content to this and also add in my columns. So after my div with a class of row, I'm going to now create a div with a class of COL. I'm going to do LG for large and then 6. So at the large size, this column is only going to take up 6 column width, so it's going to take up half of the screen. I need to wrap that all the way around. So this is the end of column. I should say end of, we'll make this the first column. So when I save that, at this large size, there you see that that snaps into that 6 columns. So it takes up half of the visual space. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to highlight this entire row here, or not the row, excuse me, the column. So starting with the beginning of that column tag, highlighting the hello world, the paragraph text, that lorem ipsum we have, and the end of that first column. I'm going to copy it. And right after that, I'm going to paste that in again. Let me go ahead and close that up. I'm going to change that H1 to read column 2. I'm going to go ahead and save that. And now you see that I've got column 1 and column 2. So at this large size, they're going to be this 2-column layout. And once we hit that smaller breakpoint, they're going to automatically shrink and take up the full 12-column width of that. So we can mess around with how this layout looks. So if I said, you know, I want this me change my comments here so I can say second column. So if I said, okay, I want at the large size that my first column is going to take up 8, and then my second column is going to take up a width of 4, I can offset that a little bit. So this is now the larger and this is now the smaller. I can also leave a lot of white space if I wanted to and just say at the large size they only take up 2. And you see that those now take up 2 column widths, and I have a ton of white space here. Not the best layout, but that would be how that would respond. So I can also add additional column classes to this. So save this. So we go back to here at this large size, we have this nice grid, but you see at the smaller size now it's taking up a full 12. If I said, you know, I really don't want that to respond at a smaller size, I can set it to COL SM6, and also in this one COL SM6. So at the small breakpoint, they're still going to only take up that 12 columns, or the 6 columns. So I'll have that 2 column layout until I get to the extra small size, and then they take up the full 12 column width. So you can add additional column classes to each of your columns so that they respond correctly. It is important to note that when you're working with your column gutters have 30 pixels by default. So this gutter in here by default is 30 pixels. You would have to override that default Bootstrap CSS if you wanted to change this so that you've got 15 on either side. So in the middle it makes 30. The column class is declared, as you can tell, by doing a COL and then the size, so whatever your screen size is, and then the span. So the column, the screen size, and then the span, how wide that's going to be. Span is how many columns. If you specify any more than 12 columns, if your math doesn't add up to 12 columns, it's larger than that, the columns are going to wrap onto the next line. So if I happen to add another one here, it would say another COL, another div with these same classes, it would wrap onto the next line. It's not an additional row, it's simply wrapping.